Once again, Robotnik was taken aback at the unnaturally green eyes that the hedgehog shot up at him, wide in surprise and slightly watery from slipping over, though he could tell, quite easily, in this light, that they were part of what made the creature appear so young. They also contained a kind of spark, as if it knew more than it let on. The scientist shook his head and crouched down to face the hedgehog at eye level. It rose back onto its feet as he did so, still rubbing the back of his head, though its jade gaze suddenly intense and stoic. Coming from something so young, however, Robotnik was hardly deterred. He gave a small smile back, and the creature's expression faltered in confusion. "An Arenaceus europaeus, if I'm not mistaken," the scientist recited, earning an even more confused and rather disarming expression from the young hedgehog, whose arm fell back to its side, its shoulders slumping. Its eyes then narrowed, as if deep in thought, and finally, for the first time, it spoke.
"What's that mean?"
Robotnik gave a small nod, the voice confirming several of his theories about the small Mobian. For one, the hedgehog was definitely male. Though it hadn't been easy to reach this conclusion, his voice was rather young. The scientist estimated that the creature was at least 8, if not a little older. "Never you mind," he replied with a sigh. "Nothing you'll understand quite yet." The hedgehog hesitated before giving a nod. His expression had grown rather stoic again, though the facade slipped once more, as a small rumble sounded from his small stomach. As if that had been some sort of reminder, he plopped back down on the ground, clutching his middle, his face screwed up in mild pain.
"Hungry,"
he moaned, softly. Robotnik exhaled, sharply, of course. Adding on to the amount of time the hedgehog had been outside and lying face down in the mud, the Mobian had been unconscious for a good 9 hours. The doctor gave a small nod, standing up once more. "Stay there. I'll get you something." Which was how, nearly 1 hour later, Dr. Ivo Robotnik found himself entirely deprived of 2/5, he had performed the calculations himself, of his current food supplies. He hadn't expected much of an appetite, though he knew the hedgehog probably could not recall the last time he'd eaten. But 2 eggs, a pitcher of water, 5 apples, a banana, a bowl of chicken and rice, 2 chili dogs, he'd taken a personal liking to those, and 3 ice cream bars, especially for such a small creature, was ridiculous. Needless to say, a small belly had formed where the Mobian's ribs had been showing, no more than an hour or so ago. And finally, the young creature had slowed down on his eating, though despite this, his eyes were still fixed on Robotnik, who had been observing him the entire time. The hedgehog took one last bite into his 3rd ice cream bar, before glancing over at what remained. Pulling a face, he slowly placed it by his side, and swallowed his last bite with difficulty. He was done, and he had the faint shade of green upon his features to prove it. Robotnik blinked, then gave a nod. "Is that it?" A nod. The scientist gave a smile. "Well then, do you feel any better?" He'd soon realized how ridiculous that question had sounded to the slightly sick hedgehog, but he received another nod, nonetheless. At this, Robotnik sat down, in order to see the Mobian from eye to eye. "I see. Do you think you'll be able to get home from here?" The first thing that struck the scientist was the silence that followed. There was no nod, no reply at all for that matter. Only that the hedgehog's stoic gaze had returned, slightly fiercer than usual, focusing back onto the ground. Finally, he stood up, now completely level to Robotnik's sitting height.
"Don't have one,"
the hedgehog said, as if it were a simple fact of life. The scientist blinked. "Family?"
"Don't know."
The young creature countered almost instantly, though his eyes wandered upwards in slight thought.
"Washed away a long time ago."
"Washed? You mean your parents were swept away by the floods? The hedgehog stared at the scientist for a moment, no sign of sadness in his jade eyes, though they were still rather clouded with confusion.
Don't know. It just happened. They left, didn't let me come with them. Put me up somewhere where water couldn't get me.
Robotnik swallowed. I see. You're alone.
Yeah.
The hedgehog paused.
Water can't get us here, right?
The doctor shook himself out of the sudden pity he'd felt for this creature and cleared his throat. No, not to worry. We're on a small plateau. The floods can't get us here, he reassured with a weak smile. The young Mobian blinked.
It's not what I said. Water can't get us here, can it?
Robotnik gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, water and floods are the same thing, young man. He tried to explain. Now, flooding is an overflow of an expanse of water that submerges land.
Who are you?
Eh? The scientist paused, his definition interrupted.
I just wanted to ask you.
The hedgehog's shoulders slumped slightly, his jade green eyes wide with curiosity.
What's your name?